Here's a great example of how to enrich fantasy by putting a little extra thought into it. This is from the comic Kingdom of the Dwarves by David Wenzel and Rob Walsh. And there's a page in particular that shows fighting against a human and what kinds of tactics a dwarf might use and what sort of specialized equipment they might have. I made a video about this topic a few years ago. It's linked in the description below, and you can also find it on a card in the upper right corner. But there's some ideas here that I didn't consider at the time. For example, there's a curved shield with a spike. So the idea is a dwarf, of course, being shorter, lower to the ground, would receive more overhead strikes. Even if the human opponent targets the head is still quite a bit lower than it would be on a human opponent. That's basically where the upper chest would be, probably. So for one, they would need solid helmets, and the comic also mentions that the shoulder armor would be reinforced, which makes perfect sense. And then the curved shield is supposed to offer additional protection against those overhead blows. How useful is that is debatable, because even with a regular shield, you're pretty well protected against strikes from above if it's tall enough. A tall shield would protect the dwarf's upper openings even without having to move it a whole lot, because it's going to stop the weapon either way. As soon as a blade hits the rim of the shield, as long as the rim is high enough, it's going to protect you. Axes are a different story, because an axe can reach over top of the shield. Whenever the haft hits the rim, the axe blade is quite a bit lower, so that's always a bit of a danger. So a curved shield could protect you better against axes and pole arms and war picks and things of that nature. A smaller shield, you have to move more to block the opponent's weapon high enough that it doesn't hit you in the head anyway. So with a curved shield, you have a little bit more leeway there. The spike is also a good idea, because the dwarf would be able to use rising thrusts more than a human would, and you could thrust either into the chest or under the chin, things like that. And also, if it's reversed, you could stab into the foot of the human opponent, which is also shown there. A dwarven warrior's natural disadvantage would of course be the short reach, but once they get to within their reach, now they have an advantage, because now it's pretty difficult for the taller opponent to defend against that, particularly since the weapon is this much lower, so it's quite easy for the dwarf to attack the legs, and that's what's traditionally most exposed. And sword plus any kind of weapon fighting, you always have to worry about the leg, because it's not as easy to defend depending on the shield size, but that tends to be the preferred target, especially if you get control of the opponent's shield, maybe hook it with your own shield or push it aside or whatever. That's usually where the side opens up and the legs. And those are much easier for the dwarf to reach and much harder for the human to defend. What I also really like shown here is dwarven teamwork. One climbs on the shoulders of the other and attacks over his partner's shield. So that would be quite effective. One takes care of the defense, the other takes care of the offense, and can of course dual wield weapons now, because his defense is mostly covered. The curvature of the shield could be quite useful against attempts to circumvent it. So if I can hit the opponent like this because they cover, I might be able to sneak past it and work around the shield, particularly with a curved blade like this. You know, whether it's a false edge cut or a thrust. So this would be more difficult if the shield is actually curved in that direction. There's also a neat design for a crossbow with a bolt clip and a large shield that two dwarves work behind, where the other helps with the reloading. This is probably inspired by a real-life historical shield called the Pavis. This is a standing shield that you set up so you can hide behind while you're reloading your crossbow, and you don't have to hold it. It just is basically a portable barrier. Whether you want to call this realism or not, I always appreciate those little touches that show that the creators have done some research and put extra thought into it, and just make the whole setting and world a little bit more alive, a little more immersive. By the way, while thinking about dwarven shields, one thing came to mind that I don't think I've seen before. So a dwarf using a fairly large shield makes sense. If you're compact already, you might as well use a shield that covers pretty much your entire body. What's the drawback of that? Well, you can't really see much. A shield will generally limit your own vision. You can kind of try to work around it, but that's always a bit of a drawback. But what if you have little windows? So with modern materials, you can simply use something like a riot shield, which is clear. You can see through it anyway. So there could be fantasy materials that act the same way, like some sort of magical crystal perhaps that is not as brittle as real crystal and would actually protect you and you can see through it. But even without that, you could potentially have something like a bar grill or perforated steel plate or something like that that still offers you protection but allows you to see through it at least to an extent. So that way you don't blind yourself if you hold the shield in front of your own face. This makes particular sense for a dwarven shield because a human fighter can simply look over the top of the shield and not be terribly exposed, because yes, the top of the head is exposed, but it's not as easy to reach because of how far up it is. For a dwarf, the top of the head is about the same height as the upper chest for a human fighter, maybe even lower, so that's much easier to reach. So it makes sense that they would keep the shield higher to protect their head, but then of course they can't see, so having small openings that the dwarf can look through would be quite practical. Anyway, that's about all I've got. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching and have a good one.